would like to let everyone know is that there will also be another opportunity for public input after the presentations that we received tonight. So if you'd like to speak before the public right now, you're welcome to for 4 minutes, or if you'd like to wait, there'll be another opportunity for you. Lisa, do we have any speaker cards this time? Okay, then we're going to move into our public hearing pursuant to Election Code 10010, and we'll have a presentation from our district's demographer, Cooperative Strategies, on the process and criteria for drawing trustee area boundary maps. Thank you. Come on up.
Good afternoon, board, members of the public. My name is Jake Rio. I'm counsel for the district with Currier and Hudson, and I'm going to introduce David Lopez from Cooperative Strategies to do a presentation for you on the trustee mapping project that you all began the process of doing at the September board meeting, and that is shifting from at-large election to the by area trustees. And the law sets out a number of different procedural steps and ways of giving the public opportunities to give input on that. And the first of those are 2 meetings before there are any draft maps created. And David's going to go into that, which will be today and next Monday. And then there will be subsequent opportunities for input and feedback once there are maps. One of the new components in this process is that the legislature recently passed a new statute that creates some additional criteria that must be considered, and so that is what we will certainly be, that goes into effect for any maps that are adopted after January 1st, which any map the district adopts would be after January 1st, and so we will be certainly making sure that the district is compliant with all of those procedural steps. So I'm going to turn it over to David, but I'll also be available for questions if anything comes up as well.
Thank you, and good evening, President Hayes, members of the board, Taylor, staff, and those of you in the audience. As council had stated, my name is David Lopez. I'm with Cooperative Strategies, and we're a demographic facilities consulting firm based out of California. A lot of states now, but we also merged with a company called Wolpert. So down the road, if you see us as Wolpert, it's because we merged with one of the largest geospatial engineering and architecture firms in the nation. So we're still doing business as Cooperative Strategies, so we will for the near future, but at some point you might run into me somewhere at CSBA or something, and I'll be with the Wolpert crew, so I wanted to let you guys know that in advance. As council had mentioned too, this is one of several meetings that we're going to have. The purpose of them is to have feedback from your community, your board, staff, people that live in the area, about the composition of how trustee areas should be drawn. And the meeting that's going to take place a week from now is identical to this. It's just an opportunity to have that forum, and anybody that missed it will get that second chance. So that said, I wanted to go through slide by slide, and if there's any questions, you can ask right then and there, or we can wait till the end of the 10 pages or so, and we'll do it all then. So the next page is just some background on the California Voting Rights Act. It took effect in 2003. And essentially it prohibits the use of at-large elections when such an election system can be deemed to impair the ability of a protected class to elect candidates of their choice. I'm not counsel, so I'll defer legal definitions to counsel if need be, but essentially protected class has been known as your historic minority groups in the nation. So the idea behind this is if the lines are drawn in a way that takes into account their demographics, they'll have a better chance of electing somebody of their ethnic background in the process. So the board has taken action in September, I believe the council said that is to move forward with this, and you're one of several districts that are crossing the calendar year with this process. There's nothing wrong with that. It just is the timing of it. But as council alluded to, there is some new legal requirements in how we draw the map, so we'll cover that with you in the next couple of slides. For the next slide is a calendar of this process. As I said, December 4th, today, a week from now, we'll be conducting what's called pre-map 2. This is pre-map 1. It'll be essentially the same thing as this, and you might have time to the questions, similar come up later. Anytime in the process, you can have staff pass along to council, or me, any questions, so that we have that in preparation for the next meeting. Or you might get them all out now, but it is part of the process to have two identical meetings like this, and that next one will be December 11th. The January 18th meeting is where I say the rubber hits the road, because that's when we come back with draft maps for your community and the board and staff to look at. They take into account some of the particulars. At any time from now until then, you can provide feedback as to how we might want to consider that. As demographers, we look through tons of data, and we've done hundreds of these across the state, so we know kind of what to look for. We know your communities in San Diego County. But you residing within this area and living here, you know a lot more than the numbers and the census data say. You might have communities of interest. You might say this neighborhood should be kept intact for such and such reason. So at any time from now until then, when we have draft maps, and even during the draft map process, you can offer feedback or suggestions as to what we might want to consider. So the second meeting will be February 15th. That is the second public hearing on the voting area scenarios that we bring forth. We might have modifications from the January. We might have them be the same. It might be completely throw them out and start new maps. Whatever that may be, that's what the process is intended to do. And then eventually, the idea here is February 29th that the board here adopts a map that best represents your community with understanding all the parameters we have to meet. And we take that then and we have to go to the county committee for a final approval, and that will happen, it's projected to be late March, potentially early April, but we wanted to make sure that this gets done in time for the registered voters to have what they need, so that in November 2024 elections can be had using these new trustee areas. Okay? Considerations, the next slide for what goes into it. Now, these two on the left have always been musts. We have to have each area balanced by population. There can be within a 10% deviation from the smallest to largest trustee area by population, but that's it. And you can quickly get to 10% variation if you're not watching what you're doing. So that's number one. You want to make sure all the areas are pretty much balanced by population. Number two is it must be federal law compliant. And the easiest way to explain that is you can't dilute any protected classes vote. You can't, for example, if you had a really large Hispanic community, you can't cram them all into one trustee area so you diminish their vote when they would ordinarily get 3 or 4 trustee areas where they're the majority. You can't divide them. It's called cracking and packing. You can't divide them, crack or pack them. And so that's the easiest way to say that it must be federal law compliant. And those first two, population balance and federal law compliance, have always been the cornerstone of how this process moves forward. The columns and the areas to the right are new elections code that the state adopted, and it kind of puts some context in order. It puts the priority of what a demographer and what the board needs to consider in how maps are drawn. And the first one there is contiguous. You can't have a trustee area go here and then a lake is in front of it and it jumps over the lake and continues. It has to be contiguous and flowing. You have to take into account any local neighborhoods, community of interests that are brought up in the process. You need to now pay attention to city or what's called census designated places, if that is something that is a concern to the community. And then you also have to follow natural artificial boundaries, roads, freeways, major aqueducts, something like that. And then compactness. So you want to have each area as compact as possible. Sometimes that's not possible in a rural community because you have to have a huge area to capture the population that balances downtown, which is just a small area. But to the extent possible, we have to go through these criteria 1 through 5 and ensure that these are components of any map consideration as we draw them. Other criteria are any other local considerations, traditional considerations. Sometimes, for example, if there was a lot of times, whether you're K through 8 or high school district, some of the questions we get or some of the feedback is, can we have one school site in each area assuming you have the appropriate amount of school sites, or can our feeder districts or high school districts also make sure that they overlap each trustee area? In the process of doing this, trustees will be grouped according to a certain trustee area. There may be more than one in an area, which we'll get to that as we show maps, because then it falls on something called sequencing, election sequencing, where I'll work with council on how do we move forward with an election if there's 2 or 3 of you in one area. But going back to what sometimes districts ask us for is, as we draw these, they say, well, we're not going to be a representative, a trustee now of just one school site. That's correct. You're still representing the entire district. It's that you'll be voting or you'll be running in one area that's it's matched with your residents if it turns out that it falls that way. So no matter how we draw these, you're going to be still representing the entire district as a whole. But sometimes in this process, communities and the board tell us, we'd like one school site if you can, or we'd like to make sure that there's 2 attendance boundaries of school X and school Y crossing every trustee area if you can. So that's what I mean by other criteria. And also, one of the new requirements is that you can't adopt boundaries, you can't draw maps focusing on incumbency. It's to be kept out of this whole process, and what they did was say, you cannot draw a map for the purpose of favoring or discriminating against an incumbent, a political candidate, or any political party. So that's a change before. Prior to this, there was some degree of respecting incumbency. If you can take into account where somebody lives, assuming that you meet all these other variables, which was often difficult, but if you could, you can sometimes take that into account, all things being equal. That's no longer part of the criteria. And in addition, the law stipulates the 5 things that we have to look at when we draw the maps. So that's going to face everybody moving forward. And as I said, there's several districts we're working with now that cross the calendar year. And these are what they're going to have to, we're going to have to do as demographers to make sure that all of this balances out and is done legally. Okay? Some background on your district. This is the census data that your community responded to. There may be more people in your community, there may be less, but this is, at the time of the census, how people responded. And those population categories, those are chosen by the US Census. They're not chosen by anyone else. And so oftentimes you hear, well, I'm this group, or I'm half and half. What do I pick? That's to each individual, how they decide how he or she does that. So some of these categories have broad ethnic group makeups for the US Census, but these are the bread and butter that people have to pick when they respond to the census. So this population total of 43,594 within your district, that was as of the 2020 census, and that component I mentioned about being balanced by population, so there's 5 trustee areas, 5 trustees. Essentially, each of them needs to be about 8,719 people, roughly. There can be some variations up to 10%. You can have one that has under 2% and another that has 7.9% above that population-wise, but that would be the limit of your deviation. So that's the ideal target number. It's going to be 8,719, and how we draw that up is going to be a complex mixture of map making and getting feedback from the community, and we'll explain each map and why we did it throughout the process too, so you understand more. The next slide has a different demographic. This is called citizen voting age population estimates, and we just took the liberty of putting your largest protected class, which is Hispanic. This citizen voting age population is different than the last slide I showed you about the 2020 census. That just took into account population, how people responded. This is a voting age estimate of citizens within the categories. And the difference is this: the US Census has a division called the American Community Survey that calls, they do polls, they do monthly surveys, and they do this across the nation. And they try to get the best reading they can, because the census is already, 3 or 4 years old now? So they do this, and then we take a 5-year aggregate. In this case, it's the running average from 2017 to 2021. And that's used to make sure there's no Federal Voting Rights Act noncompliance. This is to make sure we don't, dilute somebody's voice or crack and pack a protected class into one area. So while you have the census population as the basis for the size, this is also going to be another component, citizen voting age population estimates. And this is, again, American Community Survey. They provide it to the statewide database. The Department of Justice does some stuff to the data to make sure that it's compliant on their end. And then the state goes back and does one more adjustment to relocate any people that were incarcerated when they took the census to apply that person to their last known residence if possible. So this is the latest and greatest estimates of citizens. And this data is going to be a separate column when you see the maps that tracks that to make sure we're federally compliant with the CVRA. The other piece I mentioned, population, that's to make sure, that's number one, to make sure everything's pretty much balanced with the population, okay? Then how should the lines be drawn? So this is just a terrain map. You know your community and the major crossroads and areas that have a lot of traffic and where communities are. This is one of the other big points of this meeting and the next meeting is if there's any ideas of what should be major considerations and, hey, everything west or east of the 67, everything north of this, that's the kind of feedback we hope to get from you if there is, in fact, any of that feedback. And then some other examples on the next slide of what we typically hear is folks saying, I'd like to keep neighborhood X and Y in the same voting areas because this, all these kids grow up together, or there's a senior living housing unit, we think it should be spread across many trustee areas if you could, or we think this neighborhood should be considered a local community of interest because it's downtown, it's our oldest community. Whatever the reasons may be, that's the kind of feedback we're hoping to get. And we may get it right the first time when we look at it, but being experts in your community and knowing it, we like to get feedback from y'all because you're living and eating and breathing in this community, and as demographers, we might have visited plenty of times, we might have people who live close by, but we're not living in that community, so we hope to get that from you. Other examples, as I said, maybe Lake Jennings Park Road, that should be a dividing line, or Los Coches Road. Or maybe this area should be part of any trustee boundaries because it keeps communities together, or this area provides a better representation of our district. So sometimes there's a lot of feedback, sometimes there's no feedback. It just depends, and a lot of everybody in between. It just depends on what you think is important, what your community thinks is important. And that said, I'm open to questions or any feedback or things you want to know about the process that I didn't cover or that I did cover, but not very clearly.
Okay. Thank you. Questions, comments, thoughts, ideas?
I just have one question. When you come back, would it be okay to provide your PowerPoint print? I was really struggling looking at those statistics.
Sure.
I mean, I've got eye strain from looking at it. That would be really great. It's also nice to have that to write notes on too.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this time? Or thoughts? I do have a question on the, one thing I just think about instantly is, we have a tribal reservation in our district, and so I would want to make sure that we are very thoughtful about not, splitting our tribal communities, and so that's something I think we should be thoughtful of. So I just wanted to throw that out there in case you didn't know that we have that in our community.
Okay. Oh, that's great feedback.
Any thoughts on this time? Okay. Great. Then we'll move to members of the public who have input, thoughts, questions. Go ahead.
Want me to fill out my paper?
No, you're all right. Come on up.
Okay, I came because I wanted to, on Twyla Valley, I wanted to see how things had changed since the last time we did this Democratic study when I was on the board and we had consideration of voting districts. And as I understood when this was brought up, is that study was done because of being approached by the law firm that goes around suing everyone to form these districts. And the last time we did this, we came to the conclusion that it really wasn't necessary for us to set up voting districts because we did not have any one minority population in one area of our community that would be anywhere near a majority, that our minority population was spread out throughout our districts in all our areas. And so there really wasn't a need to do this. So I would like that to be considered, not just that we're going to automatically go ahead and do this. To set up, I don't understand why we would set up these voting districts that wasn't necessary. Because I think it's important that all of us be able to have a voice in electing all our 5 board members. For Grossmont, we only have 1 board member that we get to vote for. So we don't really have I don't feel we have a representation of being able to, and I realize that's a huge district, and they have different issues, but they had to set this up. But we're a small community, and I think that we need to all work together, because when you do have board members representing a certain area, then, like he was saying, that you don't represent just the one school in that area, but that tends to happen if that's where your voters are, that the board members are courting. So I just like that to have clarified why we're going ahead with this and whether or not it is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other input? Come on up. Just state your name.
Steve Roback. I'm on the Lakeside Water District board. We've been divisional for years now. The Lakeside Fire District has been divisional for years now, and it seems to be a pretty standard way of doing it. The Lakeside, or the Santee City Council went divisional a few years back. They were getting stuck with the, you're gonna get sued if you don't. They got ahead of the ball by doing it. I understand both sides. In a lot of ways you think, I don't want to do that, it doesn't make sense, why do we need it? But I gotta say one thing that's kind of obvious to most people. A lot of these laws come into play or into place because a elected political party decides this is what we need to do. And this wasn't a law that was pushed forward by Republicans years ago. This was something that Democrats pushed forward. So once they become laws and once they become enacted, kind of everybody, I know this is relatively a Republican board right now, but you guys are stuck with what the laws tell you to do. And it's like the guy in the wheelchair that goes around and says, can I use your bathroom? Well, by the way, I'm going to sue you now because you don't really have accessible bathroom for me, so I'm going to sue you. It sucks that we have to operate under those rules, but that's the rules that have been presented, and that's what you guys have to deal with. So it's something that is, if it's not done today, it's probably going to be done in 2 years. And a lot of cases people say, I don't think we need it, but I think a lot of this stuff is getting to be out of our hands, and it's the government, the state saying, it's not that you need it, it's that we tell you that you're going to do it. So it is what it is. So it sucks, but it is what it is.
Thank you. Any other comments? Input, questions for the record? Okay. Hearing none, then, I'm going to close the public hearing, and I will adjourn our meeting. Thank you for coming. Okay.